CityCast from Explocity.
News of freedom in neighboring villages traveled across the Shankargarh block quite quickly. Sankalp organizers like Kanchuki used gossip to move the villagers to action. They approached Rampal out in the rock quarries, asking if he'd heard what had happened, how the workers had broken free of bondage. They sent in female organizers to talk with Choti and her friends about children's health, mentioning in asides how the free children now attended school. They hinted that if the people of Sambarsa only believed that they had the same rights as these free miners, they would organize and fight back. The organizers whispered a word that made the workers jittery with equal measures of anxiety and anticipation. Kranti, revolution. As Rampal Yadav put it, it was completely nonviolent as they moved slowly and steadily to getting what was right for them. The people of Sambarsa would not need to violently overthrow their slaveholders as their coal ancestors did in the 1830s. They could simply take back the means of production through land leases, and their freedom would be secured. It would be a silent revolution. Rampal and his neighbors were not immediately ready to commit to a revolution, but even their hesitant conversations led to intimidation and retaliation. As the coal community members tell it, when a few women gathered under a tree to gossip or to discuss forming a self-help group, Patel men rolled up on motorcycles and asked them who they thought they were, quote, holding meetings like important people, end quote. Another time, they got off their motorcycles and slapped the women around. One time, the villagers planned a visit from some young female Sankalp organizers, but they had to cancel the meeting when a rumor warned that the Patels planned to kidnap and possibly rape them. Apparently, the Patels also knew how to use gossip to their advantage. As Choti remembered, and many of her neighbors and other community organizers corroborated, one particularly brutal slaveholder, Virendrapal Singh, was ferociously violent and arbitrarily so. Singh was a member of the Patel landlord family, and Rampal passingly called him the chief of the slave owners. Choti recalled that one time she refused to work, and he dragged her by the hair and forced her to break rocks for him. Later, he threatened to lock her in her house and burn it down. She believed him because she'd seen him do it before. He had followed a little girl named Mantua when she was walking home from the fields one evening. People said that he had tried to rape her as he had done to other women in the village, but when Mantua fought back, he set fire to the house where she hid, killing her. Community organizers' notes and recollections of the time referred to the situation as amongst the worst they had ever seen. Amar Saran's letters pleading for help for the coal community often mention this brutality. In the safety of their homes at night, however, Kanchuki inspired the workers, telling them they were beautiful pigeons, and the Patels were bird hunters who would keep them trapped in their nets so long as the workers didn't stand on their legs and fly to freedom. If the coals knew their rights, the hunters could not keep them captive.
"40 years ago, in 1982, two young men broke into the New Delhi home of an Indian member of parliament, and they held him and 4 others hostage for many hours. The pistol-packing hostage-taker, Ram Narayan, a very well-educated individual, wanted to bring attention to the misfortunes of exploited coal miners in a nearby state. Significantly, Ram Narayan carried pamphlets titled, 'Violence is a Historical Necessity.' In this pamphlet, he underlined the Marxist-Leninist opinion, and, I quote, 'No serious student of history will deny that certain historical situations render violence ineluctable. It is commonly known that the poorest laborers in India are exploited, so exploited often that in many cases they are quite practically slaves. Sometimes a more sanitized expression is used for slavery, indentured labor. But that expression only suggests that these laborers must work all their lives for free, usually for someone to whom they are indebted, such as having taken a loan that can never be reasonably repaid in their lifetime. So they end up working for subsistence, they cannot leave their jobs, and any attempt to break free potentially could leave them and their families in grave danger. Being so low down the social pecking order and often illiterate, they are without recourse to justice, whether social or legal. Modern slavery is abhorrent and alien for many of us, but for too many others it is an everyday reality. My guest today is Dr. Laura Murphy, a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery. You can and must read her bio in the podcast description. Many years ago, a story about some enslaved quarry workers in the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh came to light. By all reports, it was a heartwarming tale of how these slaves had won their freedom following a peaceful rebellion and had set themselves up in their own town and named it Azad Nagar, or Freedom Town. But while researching this story for herself, Laura Murphy uncovered a secret. The revolution was not as peaceful as various NGO or news reports or books or documentaries had described in rather romantic narratives. It appeared that the slaves of Azad Nagar had won their freedom, but through violence and murder. Laura Murphy's book makes neither sensation nor judgment, but it is a very fast-paced narrative in which she tells the true story. The reason this book is important to read is because it confronts us with the proposition that Narayan had made several years before in an upscale New Delhi neighborhood. In the matter of revolution, is violence a historical necessity? And now, joining us from her home in New Orleans in the United States is Dr. Laura Murphy, the author of Azad Nagar, the story of a 21st century slave revolt. Laura, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Literary City.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Almost exactly midway through your book, this is following your second visit to Azad Nagar, when you found out the truth, your narrative changes. Until that point, during your first visit, were you following the story that had already been reported?
Yes, I had heard about the people of Azad Nagar for a decade before I went there. And I had taught about them, and I had actually written a book that included narratives from their own interviews that had been taken by a nonprofit organization. And so I went in just without any expectation. I didn't know I would write about this. I just wanted to know more about what was happening and wondered, is there further research or is there further help that people here need? And so when I got there and they told me that what had been framed as a silent revolution, as a nonviolent revolution, as shaped in the model of Gandhi, had in fact been an intentional murder, justifiable as it was, I realized that there was a much bigger story here, a story that was about that murder, that was also about the consequences of violent revolution, and about the consequences of nonprofit groups wanting to sanitize the stories of revolution.
But then after you find out the truth, your story pretty much turns into a whodunit.
And that's exactly what I intended for it. So I'm glad you read it that way. You could tell that it was like that. I've been an academic writer my entire life. This was my first public-facing book. Most books that academics write are read by a dozen people, 20 people, all of them, you go to conferences with them, I'm exaggerating. People read academic books, but it's a much different kind of writing. And I had actually been thinking for a while about writing a book about a murder that happened in my hometown.
And your hometown is?
A very small town in Louisiana outside of New Orleans. And so there was a murder that happened there when I was 7 years old. And I've been researching it and thinking about it for a very long time. And then when I started thinking about the story of the people of Azad Nagar, I realized that this was a story that was a murder mystery. Even having talked to them, an old lady tells me, we beat them and we beat them and we beat them. I'm looking at this lady and I'm thinking, this woman couldn't kill a fly. Who actually killed them, and what happened, and how did that go down, and how did this whole town survive that situation? And so I had so many questions, and I think that that's where at least nonfiction starts for me, is a question that I don't think anyone else has answered and that I can't stop obsessing about.
The question that I have is, when exactly did the residents of Azad Nagar reveal that they had committed a murder to you, and why? Why did they change their story?
Yeah, I think I can only speculate. I didn't ask directly, why did you change your story? But I think that when the people of Azad Nagar were telling their story in 2005, 2006, or even 2001, immediately after the situation happened. They had a lot to protect. They were, arrested. Some people 8 men were arrested for the murder. They were let out on bail, but there was an ongoing court case. And so the people of the coal community had a lot to hide. They were denying that anybody had been responsible for this murder. Right. The on the ground grassroots nonprofit there in the region benefited not at all if word got out that there was a group that they had been supporting had killed someone. Right. And international nonprofits, although they were excited about the sort of the revolutionary stroke of genius that these folks overnight overthrew their slaveholders, that really inspired me even to get into this work. They knew that was a powerful story, but to go around selling it as a murder story also was a problem. And in fact, later I talked to the leaders of that organization, and they knew that someone had died, but they thought it was sort of like a stray stone was thrown a little too hard, and nobody meant to kill anyone. But when I went back to talk to the folks in Azad Nagar, they brought the tools that they used to break the rocks in order to break the skulls of the dudes who had been, violating them for generations. And so it was an intentional murder, but everyone had a stake in keeping that part in the passive voice rather than in the active voice, right?
Right. You did say that your narrative, went from the passive to the active voice.
Right.
So why was the narrative in the passive voice to begin with? Or put differently, why was there such a driving need to keep violence out of the equation? Is that not historically a reality?
It's so interesting to me. I think that, every time we see people in the streets protesting and it turns to violence of any kind, even the mildest of violence, pundits get up on talk shows and, in front of crowds, and they say, there's no excuse for violence. And this infuriates me. There's no excuse for state violence. There's no excuse for elite violence against marginalized people. There is every reason for marginalized people to rise up and commit violence, because every time they try to take a official route to get justice, they are turned away. And so it's no surprise to me that people, when they sit down and try to rationalize what are my options, that one rational option is in fact retaliatory violence, right? And yet we marginalize that kind of violence to the terrain of or the realm of the irrational, the spontaneous, just the absolute abhorrent violence of the poor, and completely ignore all of the violence that it is that they're responding to when they finally erupt like that.
And what is the rationale?
I can't come up with any explanation or justification for people don't want to, if they want to hold up the poor, they have to try to sanitize everything they've done. They try to find perfect victims. They find people who are young, typically, as close to the race as the audience as possible. Right? Like same religion, if possible, preferable, right? If you can find a light-skinned Christian girl, then we can say she's completely innocent. And so, and certainly someone who's never committed violence, never committed a crime of any kind, never stolen food to feed her baby, nothing like that. You want the NGO world in the West, at least, is constantly seeking this perfect victim. And so, to have a revolution that was also, perfect in its Gandhian, non-violence is exactly what they're looking for.
That is a compelling argument. Is that why you have a chapter titled The NGOification of Revolution?
Yeah. I mean, what I saw going on was this sort of sanitization of revolution and a packaging for Western audiences. And I get it. I'm not saying that anyone here is wrong. There are terrible, and some nonprofits do horrifically exploitative things. I don't think this was one of them, but I do think we need to be aware of the narratives that get produced by nonprofits and other people like me who are trying to promote the cause of freedom or whatever cause you might be thinking of.
And you're saying a consequence is sort of stereotyping the victim. How do you deal with it?
I think in a lot of ways, it's on us as consumers of this kind of narrative to push back and say, we actually are interested and are willing and accepting of a more complex understanding of how people are exploited and how people rise up.
Following the murder in Azad Nagar, several of the coal people, KOL for listeners, coal people were arrested. And you quote Kevin Bales as saying that they were scapegoats. Mm-hmm. But in fact, they were the perps.
Right.
So was Bales deliberately hiding the truth?
I don't think so. I sat down with Kevin Bales and asked him, what did you know about what was happening? And when I told him what I heard from, I could see the shock in his eyes. He said, no. They didn't kill him on purpose. He died sort of as a result of the fight.
So when you asked the question during your second visit, you got the truth. Was it simply a matter of you having been there at the right time?
Well, even when I was there 2018, 2019, no one wanted to raise their hand except for the very, very old lady to say I was the one who cast the death blow, right? And that makes sense, right? There are legal consequences to this.
And there's no statute of limitations on murder.
Right. And as a writer, one of my questions to myself was, if I find out, do I tell? Right?
Always the ethical dilemma.
Really. And there were a couple people who told me stories of things that they had done, not very kind things to have done. And I decided, you know what? I'm not going to disparage these folks, even in this book where I'm trying to expose what's going on, because there are legal consequences to this. And these folks are extremely marginalized. So you can imagine if you're a nonprofit telling this story, you're even less likely to be asking those questions.
One of the fun characters in your book is this individual whose name is Kanchuki.
So Kanchuki, of course, is a famous historical Indian traditional character who's a trickster character, right?
A sort of Indian harlequin, right?
Right. And so he was a grassroots organizer. He was from an upper caste. He decided to sort of shed that privilege. And although he was never particularly rich, his parents were farmers. But he shed his privilege and he went and lived among the tribal people and organized them, helped them to understand that they had a right to freedom, that bonded labor was outlawed in 1947. And so he was always living among the folks and they love him. But he just was a gift to me as a writer. He really was this inspiring character who was going around saying these inspiring things in metaphorical language that really gave life to the book, I think, in a lot of ways.
I'm going to quote a passage from your book about the villagers and their love for Kanchuki. It reads, according to community lore, Virendra Pal punched Kanchuki in the face in front of some of Kanchuki's greatest admirers. It was one thing for Virendra Pal and his cousins to beat and rape and even kill the Kohls. They had long been accustomed to that, but they could not stand by and watch the abuse of a kind and gentle man. Seriously?
This is what they said.
Laura, you were making a rather trenchant comment there, weren't you?
I don't know. This is their comment. I think that people do. I think marginalized people and people who've been violated just become accustomed to it. They just think this is what life is like for me.
Yes, I have read that victims of abuse often feel resigned to it.
Right. And we can't hide the fact that the caste system does some work to solidify that. For people who are among tribal communities, they think it is their lot to serve these people at any cost. This is how they understood their lives.
Totally agree. It is terrible.
But somehow, how it is though. Sometimes you'll take a beating, but then if you see somebody else taking it, you're like, oh no, this is when I'm going to stand up. And this is what they said. They were like, when we saw him hit Kanchuki, that was it.
And that's how class and caste divisions become successful, I suppose. In the book, you also call out Benjamin Skinner. You quote from his book, A Crime So Monstrous. The quote is, Few would be surprised if the quarry slaves decided to cut, plunder, murder, and eat to redress the terror. And you say, he does not mention at all that they had in fact cut and murdered their oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's another quote from the same book. To be a moral witness is perhaps the highest calling of journalism. Comment?
I honestly don't mean to be calling out these folks because I think that, they only have the stories they have access to at the time.
But Laura, journalists couldn't get away with that. And you found the story.
Well, I do think you're right. I think what you keep coming back to is, I'm also willing to tell this story because I'm not afraid of this story.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
And I don't think that this story is necessarily bad. I think that most people just think very simplistically about violence.
I get what you're saying. Now, I'm going to come up with a few phrases that you used in different parts of the book, but I'm going to put them together. Right. One is from your preface, where you use the phrase precocity of hard-won freedom and sustained liberty without tools, and elsewhere, fear of freedom, and finally, botched emancipation of the 19th century, which suggests that freedom from slavery should come with a safety net. So I'm a little confused. What's a corollary? No safety net, no freedom?
Yeah, that botched emancipation phrase is Kevin Bales's. I mean, he was the first. He mentioned. I just want to make sure that I don't take credit for his thoughts. But one of the hardest choices I think nonprofits that work on forced labor and modern slavery have to do is choose between helping everyone they know to be enslaved versus helping the number of people they know they can help in the long term.
You also use the phrase, the proverbial 40 acres. I presume this is a reference to what the emancipated slaves received in the United States. 40 acres and a mule, right?
Right. The promise supposedly was that people, emancipated slaves in the United States would get 40 acres and a mule to sort of start off their life in freedom. And of course, nobody got that.
Did stories like that motivate you? What sparked off your interest to study slavery?
So I grew up in Louisiana, which is in the south of the United States. And I grew up in a place that, where there are many plantations, where slavery was very much a fixture. When I was a child, when we went on school field trips, we went to plantations and we heard the story of the great families who lived in those plantations and how their lives were wonderful. And
I'm sure their lives were wonderful.
Oh, I'm sure it's just fine for them, right? And there were, we would see their dinnerware and their furniture and where their children were born, and they would tell the story of the big house, the great house, right? And they would never tell the story of the enslaved people who lived there, who made things happen. Sometimes they'd say, they would say slaves. They wouldn't say enslaved people, but slaves would fan them, like as if this was some kind of great luxury that we would all aspire to. And of course, there were Black children in my class too, who were on these field trips. It's horrible. And so I was always keenly aware of slavery. And I think that, we learn a lot about slavery in the United States in school. And you always assume, if you're growing up in the 20th and 21st century, you always assume you would have been one of the good guys, even if you're white. I would have been an abolitionist, right? Of course, I would have been kicking down doors, and maybe my parents would have been slaveholders, but I would have been defiant. I would have refused this. I would have stolen them in the night and helped them to get free, right? This is what you imagine. You imagine yourself on the right side of history. And so when I first saw the movie about Azad Nagar, is the first time I really understood what was happening today. The first time I understood that there were people who were enslaved today. And it shook me because I realized that I was not the good guy. I was just letting this happen. And I was doing a PhD on the transatlantic slave trade in literature at the time. And I was looking at historical slavery. And I thought, why am I working on historical slavery when this is happening right now? And my entire life changed. And so I'm a good girl. So I finished my PhD. I published that book. I did what I was supposed to do to get a job. And then I said, okay, I'm going to turn all of my work towards working on contemporary forms of slavery.
Wow. Really, Laura, you are an inspiration. More power to you and your ilk. Your crusade is not for the faint of heart. And on that positive note, Laura Murphy, thank you so much for being my guest today.
This was so much fun. I'm really glad. We should keep this conversation up. This is fantastic.
That would be my privilege. Stay in touch.
Yes, I will.
That was the fascinating Dr. Laura Murphy, the author of Azad Nagar, the story of a 21st century slave revolt. There's a link in the podcast description as to where you can buy the book. And I'll be right back with What's That Word? And I'm back with What's That Word, where we look at words and phrases that we use all the time but never stop to think about. And to help me with it is my co-host. Again, and always, I will let her introduce herself. Take it away.
Hello, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello, P with an A and not another E. What's up today?
That Dr. Laura Murphy interview was a trip.
It was, wasn't it?
I mean, it takes real commitment. And you're right, it's not for the faint-hearted.
Nor the disinterested.
Hey, are you putting a dis in disinterested?
No, I wasn't being personal.
Yeah. If she was in the villages listening to her colleagues translate what the villagers say, do you think much may have been lost in translation?
I do wonder about that. Researchers doing research in foreign countries, in alien languages. But I think with the right context and with the right questions, I think you get there.
Yeah, I get it. And modern slavery is not something we stop to think about. And it has so many forms these days.
Yeah, I know. It's a huge gray area. I mean, the margins or the extremes are easy to understand. But it's the stuff in the middle, that's where the problem lies. And people talk about consent, but as we've heard, consent can be manufactured too.
Hey, yeah, I've heard that phrase before. Dish on that.
Oh, you mean manufacturing consent? Right. The author Walter Lippmann in 1922 used the phrase manufacture of consent in his book Public Opinion. And then Noam Chomsky picked it up in his book, Manufacturing Consent. But both were basically talking about Western media that indulges in propaganda in a certain sense and then creates an atmosphere where people believe they're consenting to something of their own free will.
Yeah, but it adds up to the same thing we're discussing, doesn't it?
In a broad sense. But yes, if you have the ability to exert an influence on someone through bribery or coercion or force or even emotion, you can make them want something and then make them want not to lose that something.
Right. Is that what Laura Murphy referred to as fear of freedom?
Yes, it is. Striking out on one's own without a safety net can be scary. And so often people wind up feeling more comfortable in their bondage. And thus we fall to words and semantics. But before we reach any deeper into our Derrida, P with an A, what's that word?
The word today is scapegoat.
Ah.
You use that word in reference to the villagers being made responsible for murder.
Yeah, I did.
And you said they weren't scapegoats, but they were the perps.
In this case, yes. But you know what they say, justice is all in the mind.
Well, I think everyone knows that a scapegoat is someone who takes the blame for someone else's misdeeds.
Yes.
But what's the etymology? I mean, give me the Greek and Latin of it all.
Neither Greek nor Latin. Hebrew.
Really? Biblical stuff.
Yes, indeed. Now, ancient Hebrew ritual described in the book of Leviticus has that on the Day of Atonement, various animals were to be sacrificed to atone for the sins of Aaron, or in Hebrew, Ahon. Anyway, for the sins of Aaron, his household, and the whole community of Israel. But one of the animals, a goat, wasn't sacrificed at all. Instead, Aaron loaded all the sins of the Israelites onto its head, and it was released into the desert, and that was called the scapegoat.
Get it, yeah. But explain all this loaded all his sins part. How did people load their sins? I mean, what was that ritual?
Well, apparently, the children of Israel would find a good-looking goat, and to this goat they would speak all their sins, and then set it free into the desert, So now the goat would walk away carrying all their sins, and because it was carrying their sins, the goat would be responsible for the sins rather than those who committed them.
Right. Neat loophole. But why desert?
Because that's where the children of Israel lived for many, many years.
And what became of the goat?
I imagine the goat was miserable, wandering around the desert, avoiding scorpions, wondering what it had done to deserve this punishment.
I get it. They were always picking on goats in rituals, aren't they?
Well, not the vegans and not the atheists. I dare say they don't have any rituals.
Let's bring it back. Let's commit crimes and then blame it on a goat.
Your lordships, may it please the court to take a cause with this animal unto which I have loaded all my wrongdoings, and further to banish it to the Sahara Desert.
Poor goat. But I like that goat is also acronym for greatest of all things.
Yes, it is, but it also has many derogatory meanings.
Really? Like what?
Oh, well, goat, for one thing, is how you might describe a lecherous or lascivious individual. A debauchee, like, a rake.
I do, several.
You do? Well, goat has other derogatory meanings too, like idiot, nincompoop, buffoon, dunce, halfwit, moron,
Once again, I know several of those too.
I dare say.
Often the same dude.
That is funny indeed. Well, P with an A, load unto this goat all your misdeeds and send him away to the desert. But remember that it will work only if you load unto him in Hebrew.
I have a better plan.
Which is?
I'm going to get me a tall glass of she brew now. Bye.
And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being here with me on The Literary City, and see you again next Wednesday.